Hey team, I'm Martin Bosley, also known as Boz from Yellowbit Road, and today we're going to be opening some oysters. So we've got two different sorts of oysters here. I've got the Pacific or the rock oyster, as well as the European style bluff flat shell oyster. So I've got a Kouma Bay Oyster from Coromandel. We have the farm Matuku Bay from Waiheke Island, and as I say, the wild Dredge oyster from Bluff Oysters Strait. The Kouma Bay is farmed, say Coromandel, sort of out to sea a little bit. It's a sort of shorter oyster with a narrow, not so deep a cup as say the Matuku, which has got this really lovely darker shell and a much deeper cup to it. These are farmed in baskets, these are farmed on rails. So the oyster tends to go a little bit longer, but not quite as deep. So we're going to be using the sort of French style oyster knife, which has got a point to it. And it's a narrow blade. Conventional wisdom is to go in at 6 o'clock right on the hinge of the oyster, which is actually hard work, a lot of effort to get in there to break. It's the strongest, toughest part of the oyster, and you're more likely to break your knife at that point. The easiest part to go in the oyster is about 2 o'clock. So if we think of the oyster as being 6 o'clock at the hinge, 12 o'clock at the front of the lip, then 9, then 3, at about 2 o'clock, there's a nice little sweet spot on the oyster. So holding the oyster in the palm of your hand like this, or in a tea towel, fold it over to stop the blade of the knife going into the palm of your hand. Holding the oyster there, so just above 3 o'clock, straight in. You can see how easy that is. It goes in, you go straight across the other side, blade of the knife back against the adductor muscle, cutting through it. You peel that lid off, and you're left with the oyster on the inside. Now, the first bit of liquid that's sitting inside there is just salt water. That's not the liquid from the oyster, so it's just the water that the oyster keeps inside there to help keep it cool and to regulate its temperature while it's out of the water. So I always tip that bit of seawater off, right? And then cutting through the adductor muscle here, this white bit here, which is what the oyster uses to hold its lid down. Flip the oyster over so it's a prettier sort of rounded side to the oyster, so it's a presentation side. Also hides any nicks that you may have put into the body of the oyster. The oyster now starts to give up its juices, or what we call the oyster liquor. These oysters, Kouma Bay, a little bit more salty, further out to sea with more cucumber type flavours just on the back palate of the oyster. Really lovely, balanced tasting oyster. The Matuku Bay, farmed on Waiheke Island, deeper cup as I said. These are farmed in baskets, strung across the bay. It's a marine reserve. They spend 2 to 3 years being farmed in that tidal zone, the surf zone, getting tossed around, which takes off any nasty sharp edges. They get knocked around with each other. They're not stuck on rails, so you don't get that flat part to the shell. That's a lovely deep cup. 6 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and then at 2 o'clock, knife just goes straight in, straight across the top, peel back the shell, just cutting through that adductor muscle there, just to flip that over. And again, you start to see all those juices coming out of the oyster now. Beautiful. Flip that mantle back over there, just over the top of the oyster, so it's lovely. It's just sitting there nice and proud. And this has got sort of more, I guess, sort of more rock melon flavors to it. Slightly sweeter, a lovely salty oyster, but not overly salty. A really refined, elegant oyster, the Matuku oyster. And then finally we come to the Bluff Oyster, the Bluff Oysters Strait wild Dredge oyster. Kind of regarded as the finest oyster in the world for a good reason. One is deep, cold waters. Also, it's the last wild oyster in the world as well. All other oysters are farmed, so we need to protect this fishery. Different knife, we're using a knife that's got a rounded blade on it. This is made from those old ivory handled knives that your grandmother had in the cutlery drawer that she never ever used. Just cut it down. You want so it's a little bit flexible, because with the Bluff Oyster, we're going with that rounded side down. We're going to go in, and the blade needs to go down into the shell rather than across the top. We want to loosen the oyster from the bottom of the shell, so we need a knife that's going to go in like that. With the oyster being at 6 o'clock here and at 12 o'clock there, 3 o'clock, we're going to go in from the front of the oyster, not the side of the oyster. So we turn it around so the 6 o'clock is facing that way, and coming in just slightly on the edge, the blade of the knife will just sort of slip into that, too much effort. And you put the blade in like that, bring the knife down, so the knife is now in the bottom of the shell, and you cut through that adductor muscle. You peel the oyster back, there's the empty cup there, and then the oyster is sitting nice and proud and high on the lid. All good to go now, too, is our presentation side. Blade of the knife, cut it through, and slide the oyster down back into the shell the way it grows. So you've got the rounded end of the oyster down at the hinge. The mantle sort of sitting back up here around the edge, and that's your Bluff Oyster for you right there. Lovely, strong, briny flavors here, a real big mineralization. This is an oyster that's got a lovely long flavor to it, a lovely long finish that will stay with you for a while. It's not a beginner's oyster by any stretch of the imagination. It's probably, for the aficionados, the finest oyster. And if I was doing a clock-face tasting of oysters, this is the oyster that I would present last. So there we have it. Two different ways of opening oysters, two different sorts of oysters, the flat or European style shell, the Pacific/rock oyster rock shell, Bluff Oyster coming from the front, Pacific oyster coming from the side. Too easy.